And welcome back to Daily Justice. Our topic today is, can grandparents take custody in Washington? What you need to know about this. My guest today is Mark Hodgson, family law attorney here in Spokane. And Mark, when can grandparents in Washington legally seek custody of their grandkids, and what does that process look like?
It's a little different in Washington State. Years ago, they've actually come up with a statute that allowed, it's third-party rights, essentially, for people that were involved in the children's lives and so forth to come in and get some visitation or otherwise have some rights with regard to children. It's a very tricky statute, and it's also not one I generally recommend, and here's why. I'm not saying that grandparents aren't important. I'm not saying that grandparents don't deserve to be in children's lives, especially if they've been, some grandparents are there every day, but the problem is that there's a case in Troxel v. Granville, and it actually gives the parents these substantial rights. And that's a U.S. Supreme Court case, not necessarily a Washington case. That's a U.S. Supreme Court case that came from Washington. And that gives the parents this ultimate right, so to speak. So grandparents can come in Washington and ask for rights. However, if there's nothing wrong with your children, there's nothing, they aren't on drugs, they aren't beating the children, they aren't doing something bad or abusive or anything like that, you come in and you say, okay, well, I want these rights, and then it goes through the statute. Then what you do is you automatically agree to pay for the non-moving party's attorney. So you're going to pay this office, then you're going to pay the other office, unlimited amounts, because you don't know how they're going to work the case. You're going to pay all of those fees, regardless of fault or outcome. And then you go to what's called just this, the judicial officer will review your initial pleadings and decide whether you get even to an evidentiary hearing. It's an expensive process, it's a difficult process, and it's next to impossible to prevail on. Now, there is another way that grandparents can take custody, and this is what generally happens is, hey, Mom, can you watch my daughter while I go get clean? While I'm getting better, I'm going to go to rehab, or I've got cancer and I need to recover from cancer. So the kid lives with grandma and grandpa for 4 or 5 years. Well, that's more of a third-party custody, or, just sort of where you come in and you say, or it used to be called third-party custody, now it's called a guardianship, but you come in and you say, this kid's in my custody right now. The downside to that, of course, and if anybody's watching any of our other videos, but the downside to that is once the guardianship, the person's overcome their disability, you have no more rights. So, somebody has cancer, they go away for 4 years, they get better, they're the parent when they come back, and the guardianship's over. So the final option is very similar to a step parent or anybody else, is what's called a de facto parentage. If you've been placed in a position to act as that child's parent and not necessarily as a grandparent, maybe you're going to all the school conferences, I guess, and maybe the school counselor, you're setting up counseling appointments, you're setting up medical, you're doing all those things for years, well then the parent that placed you in there is part of the factors. So that's under RCW 26A, and the de facto parentage is available sometimes to grandparents as well. So the most misleading one is the one that they call it the grandparents' rights statute, which is just kind of a nickname. That one's very difficult to prevail on, if you can prevail at all on it, and it's also incredibly tricky and expensive and just not something I generally recommend to people. However, a guardianship can be very appropriate as well as a de facto parentage, and it can really get you some rights with these kids, because it's not fair for the kid to live with grandma and grandpa for 15 years and then they just come and take them, which I've seen happen.
So if they're seeking custody but don't get it, can they still request visitation? What's that process?
Well, not necessarily. It can be an all or nothing proposition. But I have seen de facto parentages where they're granted as a de facto parentage, and you get 1 weekend a month or 2 weekends a month or something where you get to see the kid every month. So just because you don't get custody doesn't mean you won't get time if you're placed into that. But the tricky one is the grandparents' rights. The de facto parentage can work that way, though. I
think you touched on this, but is there evidence that would strengthen a grandparent's custody case?
Well, it's the same factors as in a de facto. So, you got to look at, realistically, did somebody place you in a parenting role? Did you take on a parenting role? Are you doing it for money? Those types of things. And that's really where it comes into the factors and knowing the factors in the case law that goes with it.
So if you're a grandparent concerned about your grandchild's well-being, you do have some legal rights. Visit HodsonLawOffices.com or call the number on your screen, and you can schedule a free consultation and learn how to protect your relationship and their future. There's also a link below this video.